I make video games. You know this because you've watched my videos and you're here because you consider me, golden god that I am, to be an authority on what makes good game design. You poor, misguided fools. Let's talk game design. I put out a YouTube community post asking for any questions you guys had about game design and you all rose to the challenge in a way that makes me very proud. So, rather than pad out the intro for the sake of the algorithm, please like and subscribe. Let's just get on with it, shall we? Which is best? Complex enough puzzles that feel rewarding when finally figuring out the answer? Or trivial puzzles, maybe complex puzzles that guide you to the solution, that give you quick dopamine? And also in general challenge versus immediate fun in games. Annoyingly, the answer to this is usually both. What you're talking about overall here is the pace and balance of the game. I find that a mix of longer stretches of complexity are great for the meat of your game, with some shorter, easier sections sprinkled in between, to reward the player with a sense of progress and skill. What you wouldn't want to do is bombard your player with multiple, long, sometimes frustrating sections, without letting them breathe in between. A shorter, easier section in pretty much any genre, and not just puzzle games, gives the player a chance to reflect on the skills they've learned and revel in their brilliance. But overdoing these can lower the overall player engagement. The way to test for this is to, test for this. If you have a core group of playtesters who you trust while the game is in development, you can frequently check in with them as to how the balance of the difficulty and complexity is going. Just be careful not to change something just because they've told you they're stuck. Sometimes you want them to get stuck. It's a tricky balancing act and you'll never please everyone. But if you know what to look for in your feedback, you can usually balance this pretty well by the end. Can limitations help the designer come up with better game mechanics, or is it the other way around? I don't know what the other way around would be, unless you're suggesting that coming up with mechanics creates limitations, which is weird. But to get to the core of your question, yes, you can come up with some pretty clever design considerations when you're working to a set limit. Game jams are in a way built around this concept, both because of the theme you're trying to adhere to and also the timescale you've got to complete it in. There's also limits you might not have thought of, and the most obvious one is what you're actually able to do. I've made a lot of platformers and top-down shooters because they're things I can do on a basic level without any real effort. What's interesting about that is if you start from what you are able to do, you can then try and push that in ways that make the basic mechanics more interesting, which can be a great way to find interesting and unique ways to push your games forward. What are some game accessibilities a developer should consider, i.e. colorblind mode? Right, time to get controversial. Before I begin, I think it's always an absolute plus that is definitely a positive consideration from the beginning for all AAA studios or anything with a particularly lenient budget to always include some accessibility options. When you've got the money available to pay a wage for an accessibility designer, you absolutely should. There's no downside to it, and it's a way to broaden the number of people who can play your game, which is always good. Having said that, you lot don't work for a AAA studio. You're solo developers or you're in small teams and your budgets are not limitless. And I think, and this is the controversial part, when you're on that smaller scale, accessibility doesn't have to be at the top of your priorities list. It certainly can be, and if it's something that's important to you, then you should absolutely do it. You are in charge of what's important to your project, and if you want to go over stuff like colorblindness, difficulty options, subtitles, remappable keys, all of that, then absolutely do that. But when the discourse is going on throughout social media about how important accessibility is, what I don't want you to do is feel like they mean you. You, the solo and often amateur developer, are not and should not be held to the same standards as someone like Ubisoft. Please don't put undue pressure on yourself to try and meet these standards unless you absolutely want to. Rather than try and tell you what sort of considerations you can make, I'm just going to direct you to a channel that you probably subscribe to already, Game Maker's Toolkit. Every year, Mark does a great job of looking at a standout example of accessibility options in a video game, and it's a great resource to see what you can and can't do within your scope and abilities. If your game is about an hour long, should you be worried about player attention and lack of content? I feel like filling up a game with more content will just drag it out and bore the player. But what if people beat it in an hour and it costs money? You surely would have ripped them off. There's a couple of perspectives that you can come at this from. On the one hand, if you want to make sure you're providing value for money, then you might want to look at the pricing you're setting your game at and how much you feel you should have for it to feel worthwhile to you. A good way to do this is to do your market research. Go look at some games that are similar in length, quality and genre to what you're providing, and see where they price themselves. On the other hand, a game can only be the length that it is, and what you don't want to do is pad it out for no good reason. I know for myself I'd prefer a game that is 2 to 3 hours of top quality all killer no filler than something that's stretched out to 12 to 15 hours of padding. In fact, I actively hate that stuff and I think it shows a lack of vision. My rule of thumb is 7 hours. If your game is longer than 7 hours, there'd better be a really good reason. Where did I get 7 hours from? Easy. Shadow of the Colossus. What I consider one of the most efficiently made games in terms of content ever made. If your game is longer than 7 hours, it had better have a good reason, because Shadow of the Colossus accomplished near perfection in that time, so you'd better be able to justify it. If you want to deal with this, the benefit to you of being a solo indie developer is that you get to be more human, personable and conversational in the way you sell and promote your game. There's nothing stopping you from listing, for example on your Steam page description, this game is about an hour long. Specific to Steam, you're always going to get some people who file refunds when they've beaten the game in less than 2 hours, and there's really nothing you can do about it. Much like piracy, putting extra effort into fighting it is a redundant waste of time and energy that takes away from resources you could be devoting to people who will appreciate what you do. Personally, I wouldn't worry about it. Stop when you're ready, when you think you've done enough, and when you've realised your vision for your game. I know it's necessary to start with small projects, but I find it hard to get myself interested in small projects. I know game jams help with this, but do you have any other suggestions? Yes, I absolutely do. Game jams, as you say, are a good way to combat this, but if you want to find a reason to make something small and polished, think of it as a modular building project. Let's say you're wanting to make an RPG as your first big long-term project. That's going to take a lot of systems. Inventory, overworld, battle systems, towns, NPCs, dialogue, all of that. What you might find useful is to take one of those systems, let's say dialogue, and complete that as if it was a full but much smaller game. Let's say in this instance you make a game where you just walk around a small village talking to people and the goal is to just, I don't know, make friends. What you've done now in that small project is make an NPC, dialogue and town system that you can then scale up into your bigger project. You don't have to do this, obviously, but you might find it easier to focus if you see every small project as a part of a much bigger one. So you're actually making 2 lots of progress at once. Objective game design truths? Are there actually any hard and fast rules when it comes to judging game design? Or is it just, this is what the majority of people's opinion is? As a follow-up, if there are hard rules, is it possible to have a game that is technically perfect but also utter garbage? Game design is an art form, and the thing with art is there aren't any rules or truths at all. I'll tell you something that I personally consider an objective truth, but even that I think wouldn't necessarily gel well with some other people. Here it is. The worst thing a game can be is not bad. The worst thing a game can be is boring. I would much rather play a bad game that tries to do something interesting, tries new things and took some risks or has interesting elements to it, than one that plays everything incredibly safe, is particularly average at everything it tries to do, and has nothing at all that makes it stand out or set apart. You can tell that I clearly believe this because I made a generic 2D platformer. There's what people generally accept as working or best practice or whatever, but it's still only opinion. In fact, I would argue that when you start blindly following what other people do, just because that's the way it's always been done, that's when innovation dies. If you have an idea that you firmly believe is a better and more suitable way of doing things and you have faith in your vision, then do it. I'll give you a small example. In Reiterate, the game that I made and released on Steam, when you die, nothing shows up on screen. You're just dead, and the game stops and you're dead and that's it. And this tripped a few people up because they were expecting something to pop up saying, oh, you died. But here's the thing, I genuinely believe if you die in a game, you'll notice that you're dead. You don't need a big flashing sign saying, oh no, you're dead now, it'll be really obvious to you. And I did it that way intentionally because I wanted my players to exercise some active initiative and think, oh hang on, I'm dead, I'd better press a button. Wherever possible, I try and encourage my audience to take an active role in the way the game is directing them, because I don't believe we should talk down to our players. I'm trying not to go into a rant here, but to keep it brief. I think the last decade to 15 years or so has really talked down to and patronised the hell out of our audience. Sometimes I think it comes from a good place, of trying to onboard as many people as possible. But what it ends up doing is making a generation of passive players who wait to be told something before they'll do it. And I think that's just sad. And is there a game that I think is technically perfect but utter garbage? Oh yeah, there's loads of them. But because game design is an art and not a science, I put it down to those games just not being for me. There's nothing wrong with them, I assume, they're just not to my taste. And I know now you're waiting for me to give an example, so all of you can rush to the comments section to blast me for my hottest of takes, so fine, here we go. Horizon Zero Dawn, have at it. How do you feel about small mini-games or side content and secrets in games? Do you think it's crucial to make a good game or unnecessary? I think minigames and side content is by its very nature very optional. But I think if it's done right, it can elevate a core gameplay loop to something very special. And more than that, if you do it even better, it can become part of the whole identity of the game. The best examples of this, I think, are the Yakuza series, where the side quests and minigames add to the immersion and appeal of a living, breathing Kamurocho, and Majora's Mask, where what is technically the optional side content contains so much of the plot and world building of this tragically miserable place. I don't think it's crucial, but I think if you know it's going to form part of your core vision, then you should probably spend as much time on them as you do for your primary gameplay loop. In fact, this might even be another example for that previous question about how to focus on smaller projects. Spend the time making a great version of your minigame, and by the time you come to include it in your bigger project, it'll already be polished and ready to go. One thing that does annoy me about supposedly optional side content is when it's actually not optional. There have been games I've played before, and none of them spring to mind right now because obviously I need them to, so obviously I can't remember them, but you know they exist, where you have to do a set number of side missions before the main story will progress. I hate that, don't do it, it's annoying, it's a form of padding, it's a waste of time, and it's very weak. Kind of a specific question here, how do you assess your own skills? Say you're a programmer, how do you know you should apply to jobs? When you can create anything, when you've experienced most of the coding language, or just when you've been learning for a long time? How do you assess your own skills? Easy. You don't. You're awful at it. You are, in fact, the worst person in the world at being able to tell how good you actually are, because you're so close to it all the time with so much invested in it emotionally that you can't be accurate and objective anymore. I would love to tell you that once you've shipped a game, published 2 more, started a YouTube channel and come up on 10,000 subscribers, it gets easier, but it doesn't. Because then you'll run into imposter syndrome instead, where you think it's all hilariously fake because oh my god you're awful at everything and how have you conned this many people into thinking you know what you're doing. And the genius part, and the part that answers the rest of your question, is this. Fake it. Fake it all the time. Pretend you're a con man and you're trying to trick people like a nefarious rogue into believing a massive lie. Apply for jobs you don't think you're qualified for, because if you think about it, it's not up to you to decide if you're qualified for it anyway. It's up to the person interviewing you for the job. That's part of their job, not yours. So let them worry about whether you're qualified enough or not. The worst thing they can do is say no. And this isn't really anything to do with game design, but a little bit of life advice for you because I'm an old man. If you ever go for a job interview and later on find out you didn't get the job, make sure you ask for feedback. Because if you've had a good interviewer, they'll tell you exactly what they were looking for that you didn't provide, and you can use that to do better next time. This is one I'm going to stumble into soon. How do you make passive gameplay engaging? So for context purposes, I assume by passive you mean something like a farming or gathering system, or maybe a background leveling system like a virtual pet or whatever. The main thing really is to look at how much interactivity you want to force from your player. How involved do they need to be? Is it a minigame or a button? If you want comparisons, by the way, look at some fishing minigames. Compare Final Fantasy XV's fishing minigame, which is very, very involved, to the one in Stardew Valley, which is a quick sort of QTE button press. There's a spectrum of interactivity there that works differently on different people. A general guiding principle though is to think about how much attention you want your player to pay to this particular gameplay anyway. How important is it that they are engaged? So in Stardew Valley, for example, fishing is one of a dozen different farming and gathering mechanics you're doing at any one time, so it doesn't need to be a massive chunk of your primary loop. But in Final Fantasy XV, it's so drastically different to your primary loop that it gets fleshed out as a mini-game all of its own, since people who are into it will want to dedicate some time to it. I don't know about you, but I'm addicted to fishing mini-games, have been ever since Ocarina of Time. I'd never actually go fishing because it seems incredibly boring in real life, but something about fishing mini-games just hooks me. Taking that a step further, this is going to sound really counterintuitive, but have you ever considered whether you want your player to be engaged in your passive gameplay at all? I'll give you an example. Lately, thanks to the Outlaws update, I've been playing a lot of No Man's Sky. Now, a big part of No Man's Sky is just wandering around gathering resources with your mining beam. It's not engaging at all. It's nearly automated to a point that you can do it without really paying any attention. But at 10 PM, when I'm winding down for the day and I'm getting ready for bed, it's perfect. It's a beautiful setting, a repetitive action, it's slowly adding to my overall progress in the game, and it's something that I can do that I don't really need to think about, but I still enjoy it because of how it's presented and wrapped up. I'm not engaged because I don't want to be engaged at that specific point. So consider whether or not it's actually vital that the passive gameplay you're talking about is even engaging at all, based on the intent you have for that mechanic and how it fits into your game as a whole. What are those? I'm very funny. Icosa. What ultimately makes a platformer game bad? First of all, you are very funny. Secondly, it depends on what kind of platformer it's trying to be, but that's not really much of an answer, is it? I think any kind of platformer, even the old cinematic ones like Prince of Persia and Flashback, you always want a consistent, replicable and reliable movement speed. Some of the worst platformers ever made in both 2D and 3D, Metroidvanias, technical platformers, speedy platformers, run and guns, whatever they are, the worst ones always have the problem where you can't reliably move around. Whether that's because the physics are messed up, or the camera's too close and you can't see where you're going, or the momentum seems random, or there isn't a clear definition between what's an active interactive platform and what's just window dressing. Whatever it is, it's always something that messes with your ability to just move around properly. No matter what subgenre of platformer you're in, I think the starting point and the absolute basic foundation of what you're building on top of is whether or not moving around, the basic act of moving from one point to another, is reliable, understandable, and replicable, where you learn to do it once, maybe twice, and you can do it again for the rest of the game. Without that, you cannot make a good platformer. Are there any game mechanics you think are truly outdated? No, there are no outdated game mechanics, only outdated gamers. That's a hell of a soundbite, isn't it? But seriously though, if you're a good enough designer and you know how and why you want to use an old mechanic, you can make anything work. Just to reach into the Black Country Games back catalogue, you might know that I published a game called Quickly Quackly, a fast-paced 2D platformer with a 13-second time limit on each level. Jay, who developed that game, has publicly said they did so because somebody on Twitter made the frankly ignorant statement that time limits in game design were outdated and had no place in modern games. Thus, a game built entirely around time limits that has a positive rating on Steam and has done very, very well. The big one that I think people bring up a lot these days is live systems. Are they really out of date though? Or are they just not being used properly, in a way that engages people today? Maybe I should go and do something small but polished in the way that Quackly reframed time limits, to show the value of a live system if you design it for a modern audience. Let me know in the comments if you want me to have a go at it, and maybe I'll see what I can do. And although I've got loads and loads more questions to get through, I think for today, for this part, that's probably enough, because I've rambled forever. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions, and if you've got any more you'd like answering, drop them in the comments below and I'll add them to the list for the next episode. Oh, and actually there is one more, very, very quickly. Do you put milk before or after cereals? Anyone who puts their milk in before their cereal is some kind of inhuman monster, and it is your right and in fact duty to exclude them from civilized society. And if you've liked this video, then like this video and subscribe for more videos like this one, and I will see you the next time I'm thinking, hey, let's talk game design.